Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anvarghese and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all to today's special lecture titled Staying the Course, Understanding China's Restrained Reaction to the US-Pakistan Rapprochement. Despite the rocky relationship between the US and Pakistan in the past, the recent moves by the Trump administration, pointing to a developing rapprochement between the two, has been piquing geopolitical interest. Given the concerns over the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the development of the Pasni port, and Pakistan's reliability as an ally, China's reaction has been under close scrutiny. This special lecture will explore the dynamics of China's stance towards the recent deepening cooperation between the US and Pakistan in an attempt to shed light on the reasonings behind this relatively restrained response. The speaker for today's lecture is Dr. Ivan Lidarev. Dr. Lidarev is an Asian security and international relations expert who specializes in China-India relations and China's role in South Asia. Currently, he is a visiting research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and visiting lecturer at Sofia University, Bulgaria. The chair for today's lecture is Professor Alka Acharya. She is the director of the Institute of Chinese Studies and former professor and chairperson of the Center of East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Acharya.
Thank you, Anne, and a very, very good afternoon to all our listeners who have joined online and offline, and especially warm welcome once again to Ivan, who will be connecting after 7 years, he informs me. It seems much shorter, but we had very, very interesting exchanges when he was here in his last stint. So I'm really happy at being able to welcome you once again to the Institute, Ivan. You have a topic that is going to certainly interest a great many people, you know. People talk about Pakistan, we all are agog. We talk about China. Of course, that's a big question. When you talk about China and Pakistan together, that's a combination that is certainly going to be. We are trying to understand this relationship in very many different ways, and you can find assessments and understanding from both the one end to the other end of the spectrum. There are people who look upon this relationship as one which is chiefly directed at India, and those who are prepared to concede the strategic calculations that may weigh in on China as it builds its partnership with Pakistan. And this is nothing new in any case. I mean, right from the time we gained independence, Pakistan and India, China has been a major player as far as both of us are concerned, largely because of the boundary issues. So this has been with us all along. It has seen many ups and many downs, and I would really not like to second guess what you would be arguing, though your title, which is certainly Restrained Reaction, is quite tantalizing. Except that when we possibly decided on this topic, this rapprochement that you talk about seems to have become a bit shaky in the last couple of days. Now we hear reports that Pakistan is reaching out to the new regime in Iran, which is certainly not to the liking of the occupant of the White House. And so the dynamics are swirling about so rapidly that I think the reactions actually have to be calibrated on a scale of 1 to 10 on the basis of what is really happening, and then trying to figure out what exactly is happening in the relationship. But to the extent that there are certain fundamentals in the China-Pakistan relationship which have withstood the test of time, to that extent, Pakistan's flexibility in terms of its dealings with Russia, with US, with the countries of Middle East, the Gulf, I think that has been fairly well accommodated within the framework of the Sino-Pakistani relationship. So I'm really looking forward to how you interpret restrained reaction, and why do you think it is restrained? Is it the case that the Chinese have been rather upset and are not showing it? Or is it the case that they are aware of what is probably constraining Pakistan and therefore choose not to make a song and dance about it? So, yeah, I mean, these are some of the questions I have. I've already put them on board, but really, I'm looking forward to what would be your assessment of this development. So, yes, Ivan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Well, first, it's a real pleasure being in the ICS. And also, it's a great pleasure to reconnect with Professor Acharya, who I met 7 years ago. We had some very interesting interactive sessions, and from who I have learned a lot and continue to learn to this day. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure speaking at ICS. I'll unpack many of those questions in my presentation, but the most recent events, including on Iran, I think it will be more productive to discuss them during the Q&A. I'm pretty sure that it will be very lively Q&A, and very often some of the most interesting stuff comes out in the Q&A period. So I'll first give my presentation, and then we'll be very happy to move to the Q&A period. Now, my presentation will examine China's reaction to the rapprochement between Washington and Islamabad in the last year or so, Beijing's reasons for this reaction. The key question is, why has Beijing reacted in this way? So first, I will introduce very briefly the rapprochement. Then I will look into China's concerns about this rapprochement. Then I will examine China's reaction, both official and unofficial, to this rapprochement. And finally, I will explain the reasons behind this reaction. So let's start. The US-Pakistan rapprochement doesn't need really an introduction. I'm sure that many of our watchers and listeners are very well familiar with it. But very broadly, this rapprochement started last year, and it has involved a very good personal relationship between President Trump and the General, now Field Marshal Asim Munir. It has involved initiatives on critical minerals, the potential development of the port of Pasni, crypto initiatives, offers to mediate the Kashmir dispute, which of course are very, very unpopular here in India. Also, there has been substantial anti-Iran cooperation. For example, Pakistan closed its official border crossings with Iran at one point under US influence, although I'm pretty sure that a lot of undocumented stuff happens on this border, regardless of what happens at the official border crossings. Of course, Pakistan has also joined the Board of Peace. Each of these topics is large, and we can unpack it during the Q&A. When it comes down to trade, also there has been a massive trade deal between the US and Pakistan, which has included provisions about oil exploration, 19% tariff rate for Pakistan, and generally speaking, I would argue that Pakistan has reached out to the US, and the US has been very receptive. Now, one can think of this, simply put, as a Pakistani initiative to which the US has responded, but I think that it's also very important to look at this recent rapprochement from American perspective, because ultimately it is the Pakistanis who are in many ways knocking on an open door. And I think that it's critical to understand that this is part of a much larger US engagement in South Asia. You can see it very clearly in Bangladesh too. You can see it to much smaller extent in Sri Lanka. In Bangladesh, for example, during the last year and a half, there has been a number of US initiatives. There have been military exercises. Some of them are old exercises, but they have been conducted much more frequently at and at larger scale than before. Of course, there was a trade agreement between the US and Bangladesh, which clearly was directed against China. It had actually a provision even, which was China relevant. So there is a much larger process of US engagement with South Asia. And I think it is critical for us to understand that much of this engagement is focused on balancing China. Now, what do I mean by focus on balancing China? Of course, the US has always been a factor, excuse me, in China-Pakistan relations, but it is very clear that in the last couple of years, excuse me, Chinese influence in Pakistan has massively, excuse me, has massively increased. And this influence has been related in the last decade to the development of the BRI, to massive arms exports. Now, about 80% of Pakistan's arm imports are actually coming from China. 80%, that's a very high number. So it's very obvious that China has made very substantial inroads into Pakistan. And I believe that the United States feels deeply uncomfortable with this and with the strategic implications of this great growth in Chinese influence in Pakistan, and they have made a concerted effort to re-engage Pakistan. And very often, this effort has been framed in terms of balancing China, not only implicitly but also explicitly. And you can see this most clearly in the critical minerals initiative, which is clearly designed to reduce Chinese bargaining advantage vis-a-vis the United States, because as we all know, critical minerals formed a very important part of the US-China trade back and forth in the last year or so. So, on this background, clearly there is a substantial rapprochement between the US and Pakistan. And it's important to realize, by the way, here that this rapprochement comes after a long period in which the two sides have been relatively estranged. So if you look for the whole period after 2011, after the Abbottabad raid that killed Osama bin Laden, U.S. involvement in Pakistan has been progressively more and more reduced, and of course this increased even further after the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021. On this background, there is clearly a major revival of US re-engagement in Pakistan. And this is not just going back to business as usual. This is kind of a whole new concerted initiative. Now, of course, for China, this initiative is inherently raising a lot of questions and raising a lot of concerns. So what are China's concerns about this US re-engagement of Pakistan? I think that there are primarily four major concerns. The first concern is, of course, that the increase in US presence in Pakistan would allow Washington to monitor Chinese activities, lines of communications, and installations on Pakistani territory. Potentially, one can even imagine American presence in Pakistan, which is able to put parts of China, especially Xinjiang, under surveillance. This is, of course, very, very discomforting for China. Then another aspect of this is that the improved US-Pakistan relations opened the door for increased US military presence in Pakistan, potentially. Some people have even discussed the port of Pasni as a potential military facility, or at least a facility in which American military personnel might be stationed. Predictably, this is not something that China likes. And then, of course, the prospective development of Pakistan's critical minerals, as we just mentioned recently, has a major implication for the China-US trade relationship, because obviously China has been using rare earths and critical minerals as a source of leverage, and it turned out to be a very, very important source of leverage, which managed to deliver very substantial results for China last year. Finally, a closer US-Pakistan relationship might potentially give US access to sensitive Chinese technology, including military technology. And of course, this is, uncomfortable for China. And of course, this can have very substantial implications in a potential US-China conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So there are these concerns, but beyond them, I think that there are also two major challenges which are very important when thinking the US-Pakistan rapprochement. And one challenge is the question of Pakistan's reliability. Essentially, the recent developments in US-Pakistan relations demonstrate that Pakistan is by no means as reliable a Chinese partner as probably many in Beijing believed before. And of course, better relations between Islamabad and Washington mean less leverage for Beijing in their bilateral relations. So very obviously, this is not comfortable for China. However, one should not exaggerate China's concerns about US-Pakistan relations. For example, when it comes down to CPEC when it comes down to American access to Pakistani facilities, one has to bear in mind that much of the China-Pakistan economic corridor was actually built at a period when there was American presence in Pakistan. And obviously, this did not impede the progress of CPEC. And then, of course, there are rumors that there is still American personnel in Pakistan. For example, there are persistent claims that there is American personnel in the Nur Khan base in Pakistan. And then, of course, Pakistan's cooperation with Washington in terms of critical minerals, while very well publicized, is probably at a very nascent stage. Pakistan is a deeply unstable country in which it's very difficult to develop the transportation network necessary for the mining and export of critical minerals. And if the United States really wants to diminish Chinese advantage in this respect, as I'm pretty sure they won't, there are many other ways in which Washington can do so, especially developing its own critical mineral and rare earth resources, or using those of partners such as Australia or Canada. When it comes down to US access to Chinese military equipment via Pakistan, I also think this should not be exaggerated as a security threat or security risk for China, simply put because China plans or seeks to emerge as a major arms exporter on the international stage, which inevitably means that the US and many other countries will get access to Chinese technology early or late. Moreover, I'm somewhat skeptical that China is really sharing its most sensitive and most advanced technology with Pakistan, a country that has a history of leakage of such technology. So, with all this in mind, it's clear that China has concerns should have concerns about this rapprochement. And it's also clear that these concerns should not be exaggerated. Now, with all this in mind, how has China reacted? If you go on the Chinese internet, you can very easily see that there has been a media storm last summer and in the early autumn last year. The Chinese internet was very much abuzz with talk about Pakistani betrayal of China. Some people spoke how Pakistan had literally backstabbed China. One very popular Guancha article discussed Pakistan's backstabbing of China, literally to backstab, to step in the back China. There have been also claims that Pakistan's outreach to the US is a threat to Chinese security. For example, a very prominent nationalist hawk, Hu Xijin, who was before the editor-in-chief of Global Times, published a very widely circulated article which claimed that practically Pakistan is undermining China's security and undermining China's leverage in its trade war with the United States. This was an article which, by the way, later was deleted. It was a post that that was later deleted but got widely circulated on the Chinese internet and kickstarted a firestorm of commentary. And of course, some Chinese observers, both on the internet but also kind of in the commentary and in the analytical community, have argued that Chinese restrictions on magnets and rare earths, which were imposed in October, were a response to this perceived Pakistani betrayal of China and the attempt of Pakistan to actually share Chinese technology, Chinese rare earths extraction technology with the United States. This, let me point out, were just rumors on the internet, but they provoked a very massive storm of reaction on the Chinese internet and among quite a few Chinese commentators. However, the Chinese government has consistently kept its cool and reacted in a very restrained manner. The official spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs continued to describe China-India relations as an ironclad friendship, and very importantly, they also on several occasions publicly dismissed criticism of Pakistan from the Chinese internet, from Chinese netizens, and even at one occasion described the rumors of a potential Pakistani betrayal of China, especially in terms of rare earth, as rumors designed to drive a wedge between China and Pakistan. So they perceived those rumors practically as a political tool aimed at the Pakistan-China partnership. China also has tried to kind of shape public perceptions of Pakistan by promoting various initiatives and various public messaging initiatives to improve Pakistan's image back home. You can see this, for example, in a major article published by Wang Shida, who is a fellow at Kikir, which is the primary security think tank in China, kind of a think tank affiliated with the security services. And this article loaded the time-tested historical bond between Islamabad and Beijing, and it was very, very laudatory. Also, you can see semi-official articles in publications such as Global Times, for example, by Zhang Caozhi, who is a specialist in Pakistan teaching at Sichuan University. I even think that at one point he was the head of the Pakistan program there. And he was speaking about the unshakable friendship between China and Pakistan. And also he was discussing how this partnership has survived various regional and global changes. And he emphasized that no strategic changes in the strategic landscape can transform this friendship. So there has been a very powerful Chinese government public campaign to improve the image of Pakistan and to counter those rumors that Pakistan is in some ways backstabbing China or abandoning China. So clearly, the Chinese government is trying to restrain the public reaction to the US-Pakistan rapprochement. Also, if you look at the specific policies of the Chinese government in the last several months, you see that they have kept on engaging Pakistan. You can see it very clearly in the formal launch of the second phase of the China-Pakistan economic corridor in October. You can see it in Beijing's support for Pakistan's proposal to open the ML1 railway from Karachi to Peshawar to multilateral landing. You can see it also in the Chinese delivery of pre-agreed, submarines, Chinese submarines to Pakistan. They delivered to us last year one of a series of 8 submarines. And there have been even goodwill initiatives. For example, they organized the China-Pakistan fashion show on the Great Wall in October, very soon after the US-Pakistan rapprochement started to really take shape and gather speed. And this fashion show was timed to coincide with the anniversary of Field Marshal Ayub Khan's first visit to the Great Wall. So clearly there was an attempt to send a powerful message that relations are good and that China will continue to engage Pakistan. Nevertheless, even in official discourse, you can see shadows of Chinese concerns about Pakistan. For example, in this Global Times article that I just mentioned, written by Zhang Caozhi, there is an interesting reference to the idea that there are third parties which seeks to decouple Pakistan from China in the guise of deepening cooperation. And those same factors, which of course refer to the United States, tried also to undermine the CPEC. Very importantly, also the same article also discussed China's conditions in conditions to Pakistan, how bilateral relations should proceed despite this US Pakistan cooperation. So it felt very much like a form of political signaling, essentially. Underlining to what an extent Beijing is aware of the cooperation and the risk that it poses to China, and very clearly also iterating that it wouldn't tolerate any attempt to disrupt the CPEC, which was put very clearly in the said article as a condition for continuing good and friendly Pakistan-China relations. So, in short, I would argue that Pakistan has decided to respond to this major change, namely the US Pakistan, excuse me, rapprochement with restraint, and to mostly stay the course. Essentially, they decided that their best approach to the better relationship between Washington and Islamabad is to continue doing what they were already doing. And I don't see any major change in China's policy toward Pakistan. Now, the big question is, why has China reacted in this way? And of course, it's very difficult to know. China is very often a black box, especially elite opinion is very much a black box. We can read some articles or think tank publications, but we never know for sure to what an extent Chinese think tankers and scholars have access to the policymakers, and to what an extent their opinions shape the opinions of Chinese policymakers. However, I would argue that broadly speaking, there are four reasons why China has reacted in this way. The first reason is that China is still very uncertain about the long-term sustainability of the US-Pakistan rapprochement and many of the projects. For example, if you look at Chinese publications, it's very clear that many have expressed doubts about the viability, for example, of the Pasni project, or the extraction of rare earths and critical minerals from Pakistan by American companies. Chinese authors have noted that some of those projects would face exactly the same problems that China itself has faced in Pakistan, such as inefficiency, corruption, insecurity, an environment which is definitely not conducive to fast development of mineral resources or their export abroad. And obviously, some Chinese authors that I have encountered also have raised doubts about the extent to which American companies would be interested in operating in places like Balochistan, which are very insecure. And obviously, Chinese companies and American companies operate in a very different way. So while Chinese companies probably can absorb many of the risks and costs of operating there for political reasons, it's very doubtful whether American companies will be willing and able to do so, and to what an extent official Washington, can actually bring American companies to do so. For example, there was a major piece in Liberation Daily, which is kind of the official publication of the People's Liberation Army, and in it substantial doubts were raised about the long-term viability of the US-Pakistan rapprochement. And some authors also have expressed substantial doubts about Pakistan's ability to deliver what promises to the United States. Actually, some authors have even framed this as part of a much longer tradition of Pakistan over promising but under-delivering, both to China but also to the United States during earlier periods. So they often see this as part of a much deeper pathology of Pakistani behavior. Now, the second reason why China has responded in the way it has is that even with US-Pakistan rapprochement, Beijing is likely to enjoy greater leverage over Islamabad than Washington. Simply put, it will be difficult for the United States to match China in terms of investment in Pakistan. it's very unlikely that that the United States would be able to have an answer to the China-Pakistan economic corridor or to invest comparable amounts of money in Pakistan. Also, obviously, the Pakistani military is very much dependent on Chinese arms imports and on Chinese intelligence, and it will be much more difficult for them to compensate this with American equipment, especially because it's very doubtful that the United States would be willing to sell them everything that it has. So in this sense, China believes itself to be in a much stronger position in Pakistan on the long run than the United States. Also, very importantly, China has made very big efforts into helping Pakistan integrate its different weapons systems, and the effects of this, together with intelligence cooperation, were very obvious last year during the India-Pakistan conflict, Operation Sindoor, in which Pakistan performed better than expected. Although I think that India eventually gained the upper hand, it is a fact that Pakistan performed better than many people believed, and probably China is a very major factor why Pakistan performed so well, especially because also Pakistan has been using real-time live Chinese intelligence, and most likely has been using also the Beidou Chinese global positioning system. I'm not sure to what an extent they can rely on the US to get the same level of access to the GPS system, especially because the US has been using the GPS systems, access to the GPS system for strategic reasons on many occasions, including very recently. Now, the third reason, excuse me, why China has reacted in this way to the US-Pakistan rapprochement is that I believe that Beijing thinks that this rapprochement does not impede China's key interest in Pakistan. What are these key interests? They are primarily two. One is balancing India, obviously, and the other is gaining access to the Indian Ocean. I don't think that either interest would be seriously obstructed by growing U.S.-Pakistan growing U.S.-Pakistan relations. Finally, the final and last reason why I believe the two sides, why I believe that China is not concerned about U.S.-Pakistan rapprochement is that actually it comes with substantial benefits for China. Why I think so? If you look at the story of China-Pakistan relations, very often they have been characterized by constant Pakistani demands for more support and more financial support to Pakistan. China very often has been reluctant to contribute so much to Pakistan financially, and moreover, they have discovered that the more you give Pakistan, the more Pakistan asks. So I think that the Chinese might be somewhat happy that now Pakistan has another source of financial aid, which would probably reduce the pressure on them to contribute to Pakistan's habitually empty coffers, and probably it will result in a slightly smoother China-Pakistan relationship. Also, very importantly, I believe that if China is interested in using Pakistan to balance India, then obviously the relationship with Washington would help Pakistan balance India even more effectively, because it would give it access to American finance, American weaponry, American spare parts, which are very important for Pakistan because Pakistan still operates a very large number of American weaponry. So all this would help Pakistan act better as a counterbalance to India. And of course, another added benefit from Chinese perspective is that all this will create more and more tensions between the United States and India. And of course, this can only profit China. So in this sense, it has the cloud has also silver lining from Chinese perspective. Now, my conclusion from all this is that, at least for now, China is likely to continue its current policy toward Pakistan and basically stay the course. It has decided to react to the major development of the US-Pakistan relationship with relative caution and relative restraint. Now, some of this might be just an approach of wait and see, essentially seeing whether this rapprochement is sustainable. But I also think that they do believe that they are still in a relatively strong position and that this rapprochement is not sufficiently consequential to undermine fundamental Chinese interests when it comes down to Pakistan. Now, what can change this Chinese calculus? One thing that can change it is, of course, if US-Pakistan relations really developed and projects like the Pasni port actually take place. And it's very questionable whether it will take place. But if it takes place, of course, this might lead to a re-evaluation of China-Pakistan relations, although I don't think that this re-evaluation would be fundamental. That is, China is not going to abandon Pakistan. Probably it will just kind of downgrade some aspects of their relationship for the purpose of applying some pressure to Pakistan. Now, because I'm speaking in front of an Indian audience, I think it would be very important to think of the implications of all this for India. And I think that there are four major implications of the US-Pakistan rapprochement and China's reaction to it for India. So the first one is that the China-Pakistan axis is likely to persist. So anybody who thinks that that the recent rapprochement between Islamabad and Washington is going to change this, I think is is unrealistic. I think that there are very deep interests between China and Pakistan, and I don't think that Pakistan is going to choose the US over China, and I don't think actually it can do so. So I think that I see a lot of continuity in Islamabad-Beijing relations in the future. Now, the second implication for India is that there will be a stronger and potentially more aggressive Islamabad and more aggressive Rawalpindi, by the way, because Pakistan will be financially in a better position and militarily it will be in a better position, which of course it will use for to focus on the main challenge that it believes it faces in its international relations, which is India. Although of course presently Pakistan is to a great extent distracted in its by its conflict with Afghanistan, a question that we might discuss in greater detail later in the question and answer period, because obviously China plays some role in this and its role is actually very interesting. Now, the third implication of all this for India is that Pakistan's improved bargaining position vis-a-vis China as a result of the US might enable Islamabad to push Beijing to adopt a tougher stance on India in some respects, especially on issues like Kashmir. Now, I don't think that this is happening right now, and I'm not sure to what extent it will happen in the near term. But one can imagine if the US-Pakistan relationship develops in the future, Pakistan being more willing to pressure Beijing on issues like Kashmir, issues that matter very deeply to Pakistan. Finally, I think that there is a silver lining also for Delhi, namely the US-Pakistan rapprochement will definitely create more mistrust between Beijing and Islamabad, which in theory at least can create some tactical opportunities for India. So this was my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite a panorama that you have put before us, and there were so many things that struck me and that I would like to really pick up. But rather than take up too much time, I'm just going to pick out this aspect, which seems to me so quintessentially Chinese in terms of how they react, which is that at the end of the day, what are the interests that are being harmed or being promoted by this new tie-up? And my sense is that your assessment would say that their interests are not getting affected in any negative fashion to a large extent. Both their primary objectives vis-a-vis Pakistan are not either altered or significantly influenced by this rapprochement. In fact, what we see is Pakistan trying to obviously move to neutralizing what threat they may see from India. and putting it on a firmer footing as far as the US is concerned. And obviously making themselves once again more indispensable as far as the US is concerned. So for that, I don't think the Chinese are going to be bothered much. And that their access to Indian Ocean, which has always been the primary driving force in their outreach to Pakistan to begin with, doesn't get affected. So in that sense, the other things seem to me more like small time change, okay, which they can deal with, and their inroads into the Pakistani establishment, political, economic, are of a far higher order. So I think that this restrained reaction is not something that they have to sweat about too much. But the other thing which I found very interesting was that they actually were concerned about the domestic backlash that seemed to come about among the Chinese people, who saw it as some kind of a betrayal. So that was something new that I was intrigued by. But having made those 2 points, let me just open up the floor and see what questions would be raised by your very interesting, and I would say at times also somewhat provocative assessments. Thank you so much. Anne, can you just take over the question answer session?
There's a question in the chat box by Akil Ahmed, who asks, could Pakistan's ability to engage both China and the United States be understood as strategic hedging that maximizes its bargaining power? And does India's more constrained engagement with China reflect a diplomatic limitation or a deliberate strategic alignment?
Okay, well, these are actually two very different and separate questions. But of course, Pakistan's behavior has to be understood as a form of hedging. I think that they felt deeply uncomfortable being so dependent on China. And contrary, by the way, to the discourse that you often see or hear rather here in Delhi, there have been substantial tensions actually in the Pakistan-China relationship in the last several years over the security of Chinese projects in Pakistan, over implementation of some of these projects, inefficiency, corruption, and so on. So there has been a lot of Chinese unhappiness about Pakistan. I have heard it actually from Chinese colleagues also, who have been very critical sometimes of Pakistan. So in this sense, there have been strains in the China-Pakistan relationship, and that's one of the reasons why Pakistan has tried to hedge by engaging the US. So but I would argue that both the US and Pakistan are trying to, in some ways, to overhype their relationship for various reasons. So Pakistan is trying to exaggerate its strategic importance to Washington in order to attract more support, more finance, more arms purchases, and essentially to kind of boost its relationship with Washington. Something that, by the way, they have done consistently throughout their history. They have been masters of selling their geostrategic position for political or economic support. Practically most of their strategy during the Cold War was based on this, and very often they don't deliver what they claim, what they present to be their side of the bargain. So, for example, during the Cold War, they were supposed to resist communism and the Soviet Union, but actually most of their activities were directed against India. So I think that now they try to attract American investment and political support, and they are kind of creating the impression that this will be directed against China. But of course, as always, it's not directed primarily against China, it's directed primarily against their main adversary, India. So in this sense, Pakistan is doing what it has always been doing, and for this purpose, I think a hedging strategy would be much better. When it comes down to the US, I think that the US are deliberately not directly presenting their engagement with Pakistan as an initiative directed against China to the Pakistanis. Domestically, they speak about it in such terms, but not to the Pakistanis, to a great extent because they realize that Pakistan would be much more reluctant to engage as deeply if those initiatives were directly pointed against China. So I think that each side is trying to, in some ways, to use a very good Chinese term, bamboozle the other side. That's a very standard thing in international relations. When it comes down to the second part of the question about China-India relations, I think that fundamentally China-India relations are radically different from China-Pakistan relations. So I really don't think that one can draw a parallel there.
There are currently no more questions in the chat box. Ma'am, sir, if you have any other comments you would like to make in the meantime.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, because I think earlier we raised the question of Iran and the role of Iran in kind of US-Pakistan relations. I think that, of course, the Pakistani government has also domestic audience to think about. And as we all know, this domestic audience is very unhappy with the US war US attack on Iran. We all saw what protests there were. There were people who were killed in those protests and so on. So I think that the Pakistani government has a very, very fine line to walk. So I don't think this in any way reflects a fundamental rethinking of the U.S. Pakistan rapprochement that we have been seeing for the last year, but I think it reflects more the domestic legitimacy concerns of the Pakistani establishment, and I mean both the political leadership and probably much more importantly the military, because the Pakistani military is in a very difficult position because it has engaged very deeply with the United States. It has become a member of the Board of Peace, and many of those initiatives are very unpopular domestically, especially because they touch on some very sensitive issues. And Field Marshal Osim Munir has managed to massively increase his legitimacy and popularity in the last year, which has enabled him to make very substantial, actually, domestic legal reforms and so on. So he's practically reached kind of a very strong position within Pakistani politics, and inevitably this domestic anger is undermining him, especially because he's still basking basking in the kind of in the popular support generated by last year's conflict with India. And also, I think that he has been much more willing than some other previous Pakistani leaders to kind of to mobilize Pakistani public opinion around Islam. And obviously, if you focus on Islam as a major driving source of your legitimacy, then helping the United States and Israel on Iran is a very, very problematic thing. So they have a very fine balance to strike.
There's a question by Aditya Sharma who asks, any suggestion for college students or aspiring Indian diplomats who are beginning to study China?
Oh, that's not an easy question. I mean, of course, the first suggestion that I can give is learn from the best. There is very good expertise here at ICS, at quite a few other institutions also in India. In the last 10, 15 years, one can see a substantial increase in Indian expertise on China. So this is a good thing. So engage with this expertise, which has been increasing. Don't read too much commentary, read more history and more in-depth stuff, because China regrettably has become a very heavily popular topic, and well, inherently this has led to a downgrade in the quality of much of the commentary on China. It has become much more politically sensitive, and there are a lot of people who see themselves as China specialists, and I wouldn't necessarily describe them in this way. Also, I think very importantly, learn the language, learn Mandarin, and go to China, because I think that if you read stuff only in English and don't read stuff in Mandarin, I think that this would very much limit your perspective on China. So, for example, if you look at this presentation, a very substantial part of the materials that I refer to were in Mandarin, and many of these things cannot be found in English. Some of them can, for example, in Global Times, which has editions in English and in Mandarin. But even sometimes you can see cases in which the same articles in English and Mandarin have some small differences. So it's very important to be able to speak Mandarin. So that's my advice. And also make sure that you don't rely exclusively on Anglo-American commentary and scholarship on China, which is very good. Please do not misunderstand me. I studied both in the US and in the UK, and they have really very impressive schools of China studies. But of course, inherently, this comes with its own limitations. So it would be very good if you kind of draw on several different sources on Chinese expertise. So look, of course, at American and British expertise, but also, for example, German or French or Japanese or Chinese expertise, or of course Indian. There are many sources, and you see that when you read from different sources and from different nations Chinese commentary and analysis, it will give you a kind of a very much more diverse perspective, and I think this is very valuable.
Amit
Thank you
Kumar
very
from
much, Ivan. Those were excellent pieces of advice, and that's the burden of
Thank you.
our language. And don't just go by what the Western world is saying. So thank you very much for reinforcing that. Yeah, and the next one.
Sorry about that, ma'am. Amit Kumar from a research intern from ICS has a question.
Yes. So first of all, thank you, sir, for such an interesting session. So my question is related to maritime security in Indian Ocean region. So Pakistan engage more and more with China, and US uh, US is also engaging in Indian Ocean. Recently, Iranian ship also got attacked by US. So how you see the future prospect of maritime security in Indian Ocean region?
Oh, that's a huge question, of course. I'm, by the way, working a little bit on a book on related to this subject. In general, I think it will become much more competitive, and one can think of several dynamics. I think that people have tended to somewhat exaggerate Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. And do not misunderstand me, this presence is there and has increased substantially over the years. But if you look at the commentary, let's say 20 years ago, about strings of pearls, about the Chinese Navy massively operating in the Indian Ocean, some of this has come about, but to a much limited scale, on a much limited scale than many people believed. There are several competitions that one can think of in the Indian Ocean. One is, of course, the US-China competition. Another competition is the India-China competition. And then, of course, something that few people talk about, there is to some extent an India-US competition, because obviously India wants to be the dominant force in the northern Indian Ocean. And well, it's not now. We know very well that it's the US which is the dominant actor. And by the way, the recent events with this Iranian ship very much proved this point. So in a certain sense, how does India position itself in this very complex environment? And you have to bear in mind also, of course, that there are other actors. And then one has to think of the role of organizations such as the Quad there. But India, of course, is conducting a number of other initiatives and trilaterals with other exercises with other actors in the Indian Ocean, including Russia and so on. So it's a very complex environment, and I think that this is a little bit of a reflection of a coming new period, geostrategic period in the world. It will be much more messy. There wouldn't be clear alliances. It will be multipolar, but also much more chaotic. So in this sense, there will be much less clarity who are your friends, who are your adversaries, and their places can change very fast. So I think that this is going to shape the dynamic of the Indian Ocean. But of course, one has to point out that the US remains the major power in the Indian Ocean, and I think that this is going to remain so at least for some time. And I think that the recent events with Iran clearly demonstrate this American superiority. So a big question for India is to what an extent it wants to engage this dominant US role in the region and cooperate with the US, and to what an extent it wants to kind of preserve its own multi-aligned policy by kind of engaging with the US but not engaging too much. And striking the right balance is much more difficult in practice than in theory. So I think that there are a lot of questions facing India in this respect. And also, of course, to what an extent India is really willing to invest in its naval capabilities. The Indian Navy has sometimes been described as a Cinderella service. Now, people argue that this has somewhat improved in recent years, but still it hasn't improved enough. So what role does India want to play in the Indian Ocean region? Does it want to play a constabulary role? Practically, it is a country that ensures law and order at sea. Does it want to kind of play a role in a concert of powers? For example, the Quad. Does it want to go alone? So these are very big questions, and I don't think that these questions have answers at this point. And of course, how does this connect also with Indian economic and strategic interests? How does it connect with such initiatives such as IORA, for example, Indian Ocean Regional Association, which has been historically very much promoted by India in cooperation with South Africa and Australia? So how does this all fit together? Is there a clear strategy? What this strategy would be? How realistic it is? There are many questions, and they're still open. But the fact that they're open in some ways is very good, because openness means greater flexibility. When you set upon a strategy, you use your flexibility. So in a certain sense, you can argue that what India is doing is precisely the behavior of a rising power, which doesn't want to close any door, and it wants to explore its options before deciding on a particular course of action. So it might be actually a very wise strategy in some ways. Or rather, wise behavior, not necessarily a strategy, because strategy is a much more carefully calculated plan of action.
There's a question by Sheetal Bareli, who asks, even if Pakistan moves closer to United States strategically, could China's stronger people-to-people engagement, such as the large number of Pakistani students studying in China, still give Beijing greater long-term diplomatic influence in Pakistan?
If I think that they didn't hear very clearly the last part of the question, but essentially it was a question about whether the people-to-people engagement between China and Pakistan gives Beijing an edge over the United States. That's
Yes, sir.
that's the question. No, I don't think so. I mean, how many of the Pakistani elites speak Mandarin? How many speak English? I think that it's pretty clear. Where does the elite want to send their children? They want to send them to London or to New York or to California. Sure, some of them would go to Shanghai and Beijing, but I think that the Americans are levels above in this people-to-people domain. Now, of course, there is greater Chinese engagement, but I still think that it's well below being able to compete with US influence. I mean, also one can argue that Pakistan's elites, as well as the elites of much of South Asia, are actually very heavily Anglicanized historically because of the Raj and because of many other factors. Think about how many of them want to immigrate to the English-speaking world. Relatively few Pakistanis want to immigrate and build their future in China. Now, this doesn't mean that China has not become much more attractive to young Pakistanis. Definitely it has. But I still think that there is a very serious cultural gap. And also, I don't think that there is a good cultural understanding of China in Pakistan. It's a very different culture. I'll even tell you an anecdote that a Chinese scholar told me during a trek to a Chinese scholar, a Pakistani one and an Indian one got together. It starts like a joke, by the way. And essentially, the moment when they get together, the Pakistani and the Indian started joking and laughing. And the Chinese, who she's a much more restrained person, I would argue, just look at them and ask, "Oh, you're supposed to be my ally. Why are you laughing with the enemy?" Practically. So she put it in these terms, and this speaks about cultural and people-to-people connections, because the Pakistanis and the Indians, for all their differences, are much more closer culturally than the Chinese are with either. And I think that it's very difficult to bridge this substantial gap. And by the way, you can see it also in policy making. I have heard from very high-ranking former Indian diplomats claim that they have difficulty understanding the Chinese. They claim that they think in a different way. It's very difficult to read them, even on a purely people to personal level. I mean, why does he behave on the other side of the table in this way? And by the way, I think that of course, China comes from a very different civilizational background, has very different culture. I think that you can see this also among quite a few Western observers of China, Western politicians. They find it difficult to understand the Chinese. I don't think that there is such a problem between, let's say, South Asian countries and Western countries. I think there is much deeper level of cultural understanding. Now, some of this is a little bit superficial. I think that for example, the Pakistanis know very well how to speak to Americans. I mean, many of them have lived in the US, many of them have sent their children to Berkeley and so on. Many of them have kind of sent their money also to the West. I mean, if you look at the Pakistani political elite, they own a lot of stuff in, let's say, in London or in different parts of the US. So they're very culturally integrated. Many of the Pakistani military have trained in US institutions or have been exchanged officers in American institutions. So they know how to talk to Americans and how Americans think and so on. And I don't think that at this stage there is such an in-depth understanding when it comes down to Chinese and Pakistanis, but I think that they are also increasing this. So on the long run, one can imagine a situation in which there is a much deeper mutual understanding between Pakistan and China. And of course, there's also a generational element. You know, Stephen Cohen, the very famous American specialist on Pakistan and on South Asian Pakistani military, had developed this theory of the different generations of Pakistani officers. He developed three. Now I think that we can speak about fourth or even fifth generation. And obviously, the earlier generations were much more influenced first by British experience than by American experience. So maybe now younger officers in Pakistan are much more influenced by their interaction with the US, with China, excuse me, especially during the last 10 years when their interaction with the US was substantially diminished. So maybe when these people rise up the ranks and one of them becomes a field marshal, one day the third field marshal in Pakistani history, because there are two to the moment, maybe he will be much more understanding of China. So this is a developing story. That's what I'm trying to say.
The next question is by Akshat Maine, who thanks you for the lecture and asks if Beijing perceives the US-Pakistan rapprochement as manageable and or partially beneficial in creating fiction between Washington and Delhi. Would you say that this suggests China's Pakistan policy is driven less by concerns over strategic exclusivity and more by confidence in its structural and otherwise leverage over Islamabad? And what does this tell us about China-Pakistan's all-weather friendship?
Well, I think that, I very much commented on this issue, and I think that the question kind of repeats some of my comments on this. But clearly, there is a very strong China Pakistan bond, and I don't think it's going to be shaken by the recent rapprochement. And very importantly, this bond has historically coexisted with Pakistan-US, a strong US-Pakistan relationship, although admittedly the heyday of China-Pakistan relations recently in the last, let's say, decade was coupled with a period of decline of US-Pakistan relations. But in general, I don't think that it's easy to think of this as completely mutually exclusive relationships. Actually, even to the point that Pakistan in its earliest contacts with China actually even emphasized that its relationship with Washington does not come at Beijing's expense. I think that Pakistan's prime minister during the Bandung conference actually even approached Zhou Enlai and practically told him, don't worry about our relationship with the US. It's not directed against you, or communism is directed against the Indians. The Chinese were initially kind of very suspicious of this, but I think that gradually over time, Pakistan kind of proved its anti-Indian and its pro-Chinese credentials. And of course, much of the stuff that they promised to the Americans to do against world communism didn't materialize. So I think that this relationship has been very strong, and I don't think it's going to be transformed or destroyed by this. However, I do think that there are some serious security concerns for the Chinese, so I wouldn't completely dismiss this, especially if there is growing American presence in Pakistan. In terms of intelligence, surveillance, military stuff, some of this stuff is very uncomfortable for the Chinese. When it comes down to tensions between Washington and Delhi, of course, the Chinese, as I said during the presentation, this is a major benefit for Beijing, and I think that they are very happy that these tensions exist. I think that they are aware that this comes at a particularly complex period in US-India relations. As you know very well, the last year was extremely complex relations, extremely complex year in US-India relations. And while relations have somewhat stabilized, they announced trade deal and so on, still there is a lot of uncertainty, and I don't think we can easily dismiss everything that happened since May or June last year. And I also think that the Chinese are aware that the Americans don't fully understand, especially the Trump administration doesn't fully understand the level of sensitivity in India of US-Pakistan relations. I think that the Trump administration initially tried to use Pakistan, simply put, to irritate India and to put pressure on it. But I don't think that they fully understand how immensely sensitive the Pakistan topic is here in India, especially in the last year after Operation Sindoor and so on, and kind of terrorism in Kashmir and so on. So I think that the older American foreign policy elite realized this very much, but I don't think that kind of the Trump circle understand it fully. And I mean, I think that if you look at kind of the new US ambassador, for example, here, or relatively new, Sergio Gore, he comes from a very different background. He comes from the White House. He doesn't come from the State Department or DOD bureaucracy. So I'm not sure that he came very aware of, I mean, he obviously knew about the Pakistan sensitivity in India, but I'm not sure that necessarily he fully grasped the level of this sensitivity and its strategic implications. Maybe this has changed since he has been here, but he comes from a very different background, and most of the Trump people come from a very not traditional background, not through the State Department or DOD. So inherently, this gives them a different perspective, and probably diminishes somewhat their appreciation of the complexities and sensitivities of the India-Pakistan relationship.
There's a comment by Mr. Venkatraman, who thanks you for the insightful talk and especially for your advice for the students. Another question is by Aditya Sharma, who asked for your recommendations for any good text to understand the Chinese civilization.
Oh, that's not an easy question. I mean, there are a lot of text to understand. That's really a challenging question. I'm afraid I cannot recommend a single text, and if I have to recommend a single text, probably it would be Lunyu. But don't go to read this on your own. I mean, you have to study it in a very kind of the Analects of Confucius. You have to study this in a very thorough way. I think that one has to build a very big and thorough library of books on China, and some of them have to be more cultural, some of them have to be more focused on history, some of them have to be literature. By the way, people don't read enough Chinese literature. By the way, that's true even for China specialists. They tend to read a lot of social science on China, but not enough literature. And I believe that there is what one might call emotional, intuitive understanding of a different culture, which can only happen through art. So watch Chinese movies, read Chinese literature. I think that this would kind of enrich you spiritually and help you understand China much better. I think that it's also very important to avoid two major problems in the study of China and reading about China. Some China specialists tend to look China excessively from a historical perspective. So it's all about analects, warring states period, Confucianism, and so on and so forth. And these people very often look at China entirely through a civilizational prism, seeing China very much as a simply put, as an uninterrupted continuation of this glorious history. And of course, modern China is very different in some key ways. It's not very Confucian, by the way, in some ways, one can argue. Of course, there are many Confucian elements, but I mean, at the very least, families are becoming smaller and smaller. It's very difficult to be a Confucian when you have a small nuclear family. So they don't take into account the change in this. These are very often regional specialists, people coming from kind of more cultural, historical background. You can see alternatively the other extremity, people who study China very much to the perspective of social science, political science especially. So essentially, China is just another country that can be very easily understood through broad categories that apply to many other societies. And this leaves aside the cultural specifics of China and China's very unique history, including in the last 1 century. And so these people very often focus on the last 100 years, but completely forget everything that happened before. I mean, I remember one expert, he was not a scholar, I want to stress, an expert, asked me why I'm wasting my time by studying Qin dynasty history. And let me point out, we're speaking about the last dynasty. We're not speaking about Song dynasty 1,000 years ago. So there is also this danger of kind of looking too much into contemporary China and its specifics, politics, and so on, in the whole, how to call it, Pekinology stuff that has become very popular in the last couple of years. So you have, when you read about China, you have to avoid both dangers.
Truly, the golden mean, I guess.
Yes, doctrine of the mean, even. Zhong Yong.
So, Anne, are there any more questions?
No, ma'am, there are currently no more questions in the chat box.
All right. So we are going to soon reach our scheduled time for wrapping up. So let me just ask one last question, Ivan, and maybe you've been in India for the Raisina dialogue. You've been milling around with many young and middle level and senior level scholars and think tankers, and knowing that you're coming from a certain kind of a position, how do you assess the mood in India about this Pakistan, US, Pakistan, China, and what kind of concerns or what kind of assessments did you get from people here about the implications of these new developments as far as India is concerned?
That's a very good and honestly very tough question, in the sense that very much it depends on what type of people you interact with. But in general, I think that there is a lot of interest, a lot. I got a lot of questions about this, especially because I published some stuff on China and Pakistan and the US recent months. I had an article in India's World in December on this subject. Also, very often this is perceived in terms of a wider China-US competition in South Asia. And actually, I made even a presentation at JNU on this subject the other day. And I think that this is also taught in terms of US activities, not only in Pakistan, but also in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka to some extent. So I think that there is this perception of a shifting international balance. And I think that there is, of course, concern. I think that for many years, India had a very sweet spot also on the international stage with the US-China competition unfolding the way it did. Now, I believe that this competition is going to continue, but the way that the two sides are interacting has changed a little bit. So, for example, some people are afraid of China-US deals at India's expense. For example, when Xi Jinping and President Trump meet in the next month or so. So there is, I think, a little bit of a concern about being in a world which is much less stable for very obvious reasons, and a world also where many of the basic structures with which people were familiar are starting to change. And by the way, if you think about the bigger implications of this US involvement in South Asia, and I'm not speaking about Indian views, but more about my own, this potentially, if it develops fully, might very much upend the international relations of South Asia, because in the last decade or so, you can see that first, India clearly has been the dominant factor in South Asia. This is not during only the last decade, but several decades, since 71 in some ways. But also one can see very clearly two very stable things, an ever closer US-India relationship and an ever closer China-Pakistan relationship. Well, both certainties have been somewhat shaken recently. I don't think that US-India relations are going to start sinking. I'm generally speaking an optimist about this, but one realizes that they have limitations and they are more complex than they seemed previously. The same is true for China-Pakistan relations, related to what we discussed about the US factor. So this kind of shakes many of the certainties and also the implications for the regional order, if you wish, in South Asia are very interesting. So, for example, if the US-China competition in South Asia starts to heat up, then what would India do? On one hand, India is very happy to see the US checking Chinese influence in South Asia, but India is and still and sees itself as the leading power in South Asia. So to what an extent would they tolerate greater American influence in the region? And if this influence fully develops, and this is a big if, by the way, then, well, it's not going to go away anytime soon. So they'll have to fundamentally rethink their relations with some of their neighbors. And you can see this very clearly, not so much with Pakistan, but with Bangladesh and Indian concerns about Bangladesh and development of Bangladesh after the fall of Sheikh Hasina. And of course, this sometimes gets expressed in kind of bizarre conspiracy theories about and so on about American presence there, on American attempts to unseat the Awami League government. But it is clear that there is a substantial US push in Bangladesh. And by the way, you can see this even publicly stated by the new US ambassador in Dhaka, who, by the way, defined his mission in many ways in terms of checking Chinese influence there. He particularly raised the issue of a drone manufacturing facility, which is being developed by China in Bangladesh, not far away, by the way, from the border with India. Not too far from the border with India. So obviously, this means that there will be, well, a region which is much less stable. And also, I mean, this raises bigger questions about the level of integration also of South Asia, because regrettably, South Asia is not as integrated as it should be. And if you look at their kind of structures for integrating the region, like SARC, for example, they're not doing well. Although interestingly, Prime Minister Rahman I think mentioned that he would be interested in reviving SAC to some extent. So maybe there is some potential there. But anyway, there are major changes happening, and I think that people are aware of this, and this creates on one hand a sense of insecurity. But of course, where there is insecurity, there is also opportunity. We all know the very famous cliche about crisis and opportunity in Chinese. So, well, maybe there are also a lot of opportunities coming. We're gonna see.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely on the spot, Ivan. I think things are going to go up far more in flux. I think we're going to see a lot more volatility. We don't know how this Iran affair is going to pan out. So everything is really, it seems like everything is up in the air at the moment. And many actors and equations are in search of an equilibrium, actually. And there are demands for relooking the current order that we are in, and to what extent can we improve it. So all these are now. Yeah, of course, sure.
So sorry, just one comment, because you touched, I think, on something very important. I think we're in the transition period between the fall of an order that existed and the full formation of a new one, because we see an emerging multipolar construct, but it hasn't fully been developed. And also multipolarity can take very different forms. For example, a consort of powers, as it happened, for example, in Europe in the 19th century, which ensured stability before the First World War. We don't see such a consort. Instead, we see kind of a very competitive multipolarity, a very chaotic one, with the US still being the most powerful country in the world, but in some ways in a more limited position, a weaker US. So in this sense, this creates a very unstable situation, and it will take a while before the system finds equilibrium. I really hope that this equilibrium is not discovered only after a major crisis, because historically, very often that's how it happens. People learn only when things really get bad. And by the way, even managing competition happens in this way. If you look at the US-Soviet competition, it started to be managed much better after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I really pray that there is no such learning process when it comes down to China and the US, or China or India, or India and Pakistan for that matter. So I really hope that kind of things start to stabilize before things really get out of hand. But regrettably, it's exactly the opposite which is happening right now.
Yeah, so you sort of took away the argument that I was moving towards, and I was concluding this.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, not at all. I think that's really where scholars and thinkers and people who are engaged in examining these things, this is what they're grappling with. I mean, are things going to get much worse? What is really going to be the shape of things to come? So much depends on what the US is going to do now. It seems to have moved away from its traditional role of, being the stabilizer of the system. It just seems like they want all power and no responsibility. So there is really a huge amount of uncertainty, and I think we need to have all our wits before us, and keep talking, keep engaging, keep exchanging what we must in terms of solutions, but not really look for quick and easy solutions. This is a tough phase that we are going through. But thank you very much for that rather interesting and almost, as I said, some very provocative kind of interpretations. But this is a relationship that is of great interest to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a real pleasure speaking in front of your audience and in front of ICS. And I hope we kind of keep the good work and keep engaging.
Thank you. So, Anne, now I hand it over to you for wrapping up the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am. With this, we come to an end of today's lecture. We thank our speaker, Dr. Ivan Ledarev, as well as our chair, Professor Alka Acharya, gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's lecture shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming third Gargi and VP Dutt Memorial Lecture titled Sandwich Between China and the US, South Korea's Quest of Transcend Diplomacy, scheduled for 18th March 2026 at 6 p.m. IST. This lecture would be held in person and the venue for the same is the India International Center, New Delhi. Further details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.